It's great to be back with you. Hope your week was well. Today I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about anger. Anger. It's something that we often get confused about and often also have trouble dealing with. And so I think it would benefit all of us to spend some time reflecting on anger and its place in our lives. To do that, I'd like to look at the wisdom of three individuals. One is St. Augustine, the other one is St. Thomas Aquinas, and the other one is a saint that you might not be as familiar with, St. John Climas, who was a monk in the 6th to 7th century, and he's also the author of the Ladder of Ascent, which is also one of those pivotal spiritual works that are at the foundation of our faith. The first one let's look at is St. Thomas Aquinas. He tells us about anger. He says, "He who is not angry when there is just cause for the anger is immoral." Why? Because anger looks to the good of justice. And if you can live amid injustice without anger, you are immoral as well as unjust. So St. Thomas Aquinas sees an essential role for anger in the accomplishment of justice. And so in his view of things, at least from the scope of this definition, anger is not necessarily a bad thing. It's a necessary and good thing. St. Augustine offers us some words of wisdom as well. He says, hope has two beautiful daughters. And he said, their names are anger and courage. Anger at the way things are, and courage to see that they do not remain that way forever. So for St. Augustine, he sees anger as tied directly into hope, which is a virtue, and also linked to courage. So when you have anger and you have courage, then you also produce the fruits of justice, which is similar to what St. Thomas Aquinas is telling us. But now St. John Climas has another vantage point to put to this. He says, as long as anger lives, she continues to be the fruitful mother of many unhappy children. As long as anger lives, she continues to be the fruitful mother of many unhappy children. So we have the first two seemingly indicating that anger is a positive, but then St. John Climas is coming in and indicating that it's not so much. So how do we reconcile these differing views? How do we look to anger as something that's connected to virtue, but then how does anger also end up on the list of the seven deadly or capital sins? It seems to be a double standard, perhaps, or is there? Well, first of all, the origins of anger need to be understood first. Anger can come from the witnessing of injustice. Think, for example, Jesus in the temple. And he saw the money changers in there, and he saw that as a direct defilement of God's house and the purpose of what they were supposed to be in there for. And so his anger flared, and he overturned the tables. And as St. Augustine said, he had the courage to do that. And in that moment, Jesus was reacting to something he saw outside, as much as we do sometimes. You know, if you see somebody hurting somebody, you get angry at that. If you see other injustices in the world, like racism, prejudice, poverty, inequity, violence, war, you get angry at that. It's something that's happening in our environment that's not squaring with what we would expect to be there or the priorities we hold. And that's certainly one type of anger. Then there's another kind of anger that comes from within a person. So that one is from without, but there's one that comes from within. And it's often tied to stuff like hurt, excessive wants, unresolved needs, passions, the inability to be confronted and becoming defensive. Then I have inadequate feelings or insecurities, or fears, I can easily become angry. This anger comes from within us and is usually directly tied to who we are as a person, how we're put together, how we see the world, what our desires are, and how we operate within the scope of life. And as I said, often tied to hurt. So for example, if you hurt me and you don't take responsibility for that hurt, and it's allowed to just remain there unresolved and unhealed, I can find myself getting angry at you for that hurt because I've been wounded, and anger is a response to that. So either case, you have the one where anger is a response to an injustice. Anger is the witnessing of something wrong outside of myself that then prompts a reaction. Or anger that is coming from within. It needs to be understood that all anger is healthy. There's absolutely nothing wrong with anger. I think a lot of us grew up being told to distrust our anger. We can't express it. If you're angry, keep those sentiments to yourself. And so we haven't grown up being very good at resolving those negative feelings, which is very, very unfortunate because they prevent us from really being honest in our relationships sometimes, and also developing ourselves to the point that we can be, and opening up the path to freedom and reconciliation and wholeness. If we don't deal with those feelings, we can find ourselves cutting ourselves off from where we could be, where God is possibly leading us. So as we begin to deal with anger, first of all, we have to admit it. We have to call it what it is. Anger is anger. And also identify its source. Where is it coming from? Where is this anger coming from? And then how do I deal with that anger? And this becomes the creative process, especially for the Christian. How do I deal with that anger? So I'm owning my feelings. I'm identifying them. I've pointed to the cause. Now, what do I do with them? Well, if we do nothing, then the anger can fester. If we simply focus on the anger without any corrective action that follows, then that's where anger becomes a problem, okay? That's when it changes from a positive to a negative, because unresolved anger can lead to things like rage, violence, despair, vindicative behaviors, division, alienation, immorality, self and other destructive behaviors, apathy, and a whole host of other additional sins. Unchecked anger is what brings us down the road of destruction. So going back to those three quotes we started with, the first two, Thomas Aquinas and St. Augustine, point to the positive character of anger and its need within the hierarchy of virtue. St. John Climas is pointing to what happens when we don't properly deal with it. So left unchecked, anger is going to continue to spill over, and as he points out, create many unhappy children. And it's going to be like this snowball that keeps going and going and going. And we can see this in our world, right? If anger is not resolved, at least resolved in a positive way, then it snowballs and it becomes something out of control. So we have this risk of rage, we have this risk of violence when anger cannot be resolved. So what do we have to do? In order to correct anger, we have to pair it up with something. And what we pair it up with is what's called a virtue. So the virtues obviously counterbalance what can become sinful. So if I have anger within me for whatever reason, then the corrective for that is virtue. And we have to go back to our basics in our catechism here. Virtue, faith, hope, charity. Those are the primary ones. And then from that, by extension, prudence, moderation, justice, and fortitude. So you got prudence, moderation, justice, fortitude, faith, hope, and love. Those are the correctives to anger. And so when we pair our anger off with them, it balances it out and it gives us a way to see that through so that the road that we want to be on, And the place we want to get to is not tipping the scales in favor of one thing or another. It's not, oh, I deserve this, give it to me. That's not the resolution to anger or the resolution to anything, quite honestly. It's a long, hard road toward two things: reconciliation and restoration. Reconciliation and restoration. So we want to reconcile something that has a division placed in it. And we also want to restore the freedom and the love and the beauty of that relationship. And so the end result to anger resolution is reconciliation and restoration. The road to that is paved with virtue: faith, hope, charity, prudence, temperance, moderation, and fortitude. In this whole sense, then, we have a picture of where we need to be. And I misspoke on that last time. The four virtues, I forgot justice, because that's most important. So in this whole picture of things, we have the blueprint to follow, which, interestingly enough, models Jesus' teaching on the Beatitudes. So the Beatitudes show us what the other side of anger can be. What happens when we put ourselves out there, speak for what is wrong, and bring it to where God can bring it in his plan and his kingdom and his vision for what our world can and should be. So hopefully this gives you a little bit of something to focus on as we see a world that is grappling with anger, falling into violence, a world that is becoming kind of anxious and fearful, uneasy, unsettled. And what we can bring to that as people of faith is the fix. We have the goods. Now it's just a question of what can we do with them, and what can God do with them in and through us to bring us where we can be. Have a blessed week. I'll keep you in my prayers. God bless you.